Hey everybody, it's Muscle Car Campy, and we're going to start a new chapter in the channel today. We're diving into the modern muscle car era. We're going to start with one of the most misunderstood and perhaps least appreciated cars of that era, the 20th anniversary 1989 Trans Am. It had a turbo V6 under the hood, 250 net horsepower, and all of a sudden you had a Trans Am that could run with all the big dogs of the day. Before we really get into this video though, don't forget, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're notified every time a new video goes live. Those of us who got our driver's licenses in the late 1970s were able to pick up big block muscle cars for about $1,500. A really pristine example would set you back about $5,000, but that was really for museum piece. It was the first time that being broke was actually a plus. You couldn't afford any of the new cars on sale at the time, but it was the heart of the Malaise era. There wasn't one really truly fast car available from the Motor City. Camaros, Trans Ams, Formulas, even Corvettes were easy pickings for any of those old 60s muscle cars. When the first turbo Trans Am came out only a decade earlier, it was, to be kind, a slug. With a 301 V8 with a hairdryer attached, it went through the quarter mile in a leisurely 16.7 seconds at 86 miles an hour in a car and driver test. It clocked a 0 to 60 time in a pathetic 8.2 seconds. Its 205 pygmy ponies under the hood were no match for the 3,700-pound curb weight. Then came the early 80s, and remarkably, horsepower started making a comeback. By the middle of the decade, there were mid-14-second fuel-injected muscle cars again. This seemed like nothing short of a miracle. By the end of the decade, TPI Corvettes were starting to dip into the 13s, as were slightly modified Mustangs. You know, when the all-new F-bodies came out in 1982, they were absolutely gorgeous. They handled like nobody's business, but unfortunately, there was really nothing to get excited about under the hood. They were not particularly fast. And then all of a sudden, the 305HO came out in 83. Things started getting a lot better. Then came the TPI 305s and the TPI 350s. Unfortunately, you could never get the 350 TPI engine with the best possible transmission, which would have been a manual, 5-speed manual. By the end of the decade, the cars were getting a little stale, so they had to do something. Pontiac literally pulled one out of the corporate hat, put the modified version of the GN/GNX motor under the hood of this car. All of a sudden, they had the fastest car out of Detroit, 13 4s at about 101 miles an hour. Nobody expected that. Realistically, there's a lot of stuff on this car that is misunderstood. There's a lot of misinformation out about them. True confessions time. 1989, I'm a young copy editor on Muscle Cars Magazine, High Performance Pontiac, High Performance Mopar. We get one of these in to test. Now, I wasn't on the testing crew at that point. So they take the car to Englishtown. They're going to do a shootout against the 1965 Tri-Power GTO. The editor of Muscle Cars, a guy named Steve Collison, is going to do a thing where he's going to show that modern muscle cars can run with vintage muscle cars. Two problems with that. The first problem was the 65 GTO was in really perfect shape, but the owner wouldn't let us rev it over 4,400 RPM. So the thing ran mid-14-second quarter mile times. This car, even on a 90-degree day, ran 1410, 14.0. It just annihilated the 65 GTO. Then Don Keefe, the current owner of Poncho Perfection magazine, decides to open the hood, pack the intercooler with dry ice, go to lunch, puts dry ice on the intake, comes back an hour plus later, thing is ice cold to the touch. He doesn't even do a burnout. He starts it up, pulls it to the starting line, and clicks off at 1374 at 100 miles an hour. It was almost 0.8 of a second quicker than the GTO ran. Now, I don't know any of this. I get the story in my hands as a copy editor, and again, I'm digging on these cars. I get my hands on the story, and I'm just thinking, the readers are going to revolt. The Muscle Cars readers were all guys who loved vintage muscle cars. I said, there's no way this is going to end well. All right, everybody, we're here with owner Tony Palese. He's had this car for many, many years. He's the second owner. Tony, when did you buy the car?
I bought it in 1991.
1991, so you've had it almost since new. You know, I know there's a lot of stuff on these engines that's different than the GN and the GNX. For instance, the turbo is different. It doesn't have the GNX's ceramic ball bearing turbo.
Correct.
The cylinder heads are the 3800 Series 1 heads off the Pontiac Bonneville. They fit better under the hood, and as an added bonus, they float a lot better, hence extra horsepower. What would you say, besides those two things, are the two most misunderstood things about this car, this engine?
Well, a lot of people want to just say, oh, that came with the same motor as the Grand National or the GNX, but you have already pointed out some of the differences. Also, the GNX and the Pace car both have a different intercooler. This has 12 fins per row instead of 10 on the Grand National. So the intercooler is different. And all three of the cars would have different chips or different tunes.
Mm-hmm. Now, you say chips. That's an old term. A lot of people today, you tune your car with a laptop if you're doing a modern hot rod. Back then, you pulled the kick panel out, you grabbed the computer, you disconnected the battery, and you put a aftermarket high-performance tune in via a chip just plugged into the side of the ECU. Does this car have one of those?
Yes. This was the OBD1, so the first generation of the computers for cars, for modern cars. I had a friend of mine who was a guru of computer tech and on these cars, so he wrote me a street chip.
Very nice. And what other modifications? Now, I noticed this is obviously not a factory piece.
Yeah,
what have you done?
Most people do the intake on these cars. So basically, I haven't done a whole lot of no internal modifications. I've done the intake on it, a couple of breathers over there. And that's, I have a 160-degree thermostat, which my new chip writes that in, so it knows that. I've taken off the 150-mile-an-hour limit, so this car will do about 159, 160 top speed.
And it had the aerodynamics to pull it off. One of the cool things I saw in this car, and this could be misconception number 2, it has Trans Am right on the spark plug wires.
Right, that's a feature of the Turbo Trans Am. Those are very hard to find original ones these days.
And you have a set of the originals.
I have a set of originals. Somebody just came out with a reproduction set, which I threw on the car because, I want to keep the original ones at least.
Yeah. One other differentiation, these cars had different pistons.
Yes.
Than the GN, GNX.
Yeah, so these cars had different heads than the GNX, different pistons, actually had a cross-drilled crank also. So those are the differences. But this turbo did not have the ceramic impeller.
Now these cars, you told me earlier, this one's stickered for about $31,000 and change. And of course the dealer put a $5,000 markup on, which is 15%.
And a lot of dealers were trying to get even more.
That's crazy, but they probably got it.
A lot of them got it. Near the end, I heard of a couple of them that actually were discounted off sticker, as it went on.
Yeah, well, sometimes you don't get it. The first group has to come out and get the car no matter what.
They're going to pay.
They're going to pay. And then, 1,500 cars is a lot.
I mean, I couldn't get one when they first came out. All the dealerships were only allowed 2 each. So this was one that sold out of the local St. Petersburg Crown Pontiac. And I was able to get it a couple of years later. So my car is number 463 out of the 1555 that were built. That's the build number plus 5 pilot cars.
When we talk about the number built, that might be another misconception. Originally, Pontiac said we're only going to build 1,500. So there were more than 1,500 made.
And then there was 15,
So there was 1,555 plus 5 prototypes.
Right.
I think one of the things just hanging out with you here during our shoot, people have been coming up, they don't know what it is. I mean, you and I are car guys. We were young men back then when they came out. A lot of people don't realize now that there was a turbo V6 Trans Am and was 1 year only.
1 year.
1989.
Because the Buick Grand Nationals were the hot thing of the 80s. In 86, 84, 5, 6, 7. 6 and 7 had the intercoolers. Then the GNX was very expensive, and people, they were getting good money for those. They still sell for over $100,000 today. 547 of those cars built. So, I missed out on all that, and I was still young and poor, but I was able to get this car that came out just 89 only, and when I found out they were going to put this motor in this car, I was like, now I have to have it. I have to do whatever it takes. One of the things with the GTAs and also the Turbo Trans Am with these cross-lace wheels, and people don't know, is that there's different offsets on the front and the back tires. So the fronts are going to have the deep, which intuitively you think the deep would be on the back tires, but if you ever get your tires changed, make sure that they put them on the right front and back. And this is something I look at in car shows if I see a GTA to see if they got it right. When you bought a 20th anniversary Trans Am, it also happened to be the Indy Pace car that year. So the decals came in an owner's kit, and it was up to the owners if they wanted to put the decals on or not. And incidentally, the 89 Turbo Trans Am was the first car to pace the Indy 500 with no modifications at all. They were driven to the track and fitted with strobe lights. There was even a publicity stunt where the 3 cars that were actually used for pace car duties were broken in and then sent to dealerships in LA, Boston, and Miami. And then they sent members of the press to those dealerships to pick them up, drive them to the track, fitted with lights, and they paced the Indy 500.
By the late 80s, Pontiac had really sorted out the interior of the Trans Am. A lot of the hard edge plastic was gone, replaced with softer edge or at least less intrusive plastics. Tony's added his own touches on this interior, including 2-tone seat covers front and rear. He added a little cover for the steering wheel. We dig the gauge cluster on this car with that grid pattern on it. On the headrests, he added a Turbo Trans Am embroidery. It's very tastefully done. It looks like it could be a factory piece. In the center console, he added a double DIN radio that when he turns the key on, Turbo Trans Am pops up on the main screen. You know, this is the first time I've been sitting in one of these cars in close to 35 years. It's a little crazy to think. But you do it all the time.
All the time.
You love this car, don't you?
I drive it to work, groceries, whatever. It's still not my every single day car, but
it's got over 100,000 miles on it. You do love driving it. I mean, everywhere we've been with this car so far, people stop and ask you questions about it. It's no different than a vintage muscle car. Although I guess at 35 years of age, it's vintage. Still a great looking car. I mean, it's GM styling. Studio 3 still had it going on.
this car does have a celebrity death. Did you know about that?
No.
Do you remember the comedian Sam Kinison?
Sure.
He was driving one of these, and I think it was a drunk driver, a young kid.
Drunk driver hit him.
Drunk driver hit him, and he wasn't wearing his seatbelt, and he was the fatality in that accident.
Wow.
I think his passenger survived.
Jeez.
Yeah.
He was a wild man. This was a wild car.
Yeah. This wasn't physically a loud car, but it got its attention.
Yep.
Without the decals, it's very stealthy. People think it's a GTA, nothing special.
The question I always ask is, what is your favorite part of the car? That's my go-to question for everybody.
Oh, I mean the power for this car. Because I gave up other quick cars for this. I had a 72 Corvette, I had a 70 Mach 1 Mustang, but this would run circles around. This ride's pretty smooth for a 35-year-old car.
Yeah.
I did put Bilstein shocks on it. Of course, the original shocks, 35 years old now. The president of the company that did the conversions made 2 convertibles out of these cars, and then they decided it was not a very good idea because the cars just had too much torque and twist and flex to be a convertible.
Yeah, I mean, they flexed a lot with just T-tops. I say if the 77 had this engine, you for T-Justice never would have been anywhere near Burt Reynolds.
Then you wouldn't have the movie.
No. As an automotive journalist, I kind of just missed this car. You know, my first long leads and such were around 1990, 91. So I know they held the press preview at Riverside Raceway for this car and Pontiacs in general that year. And one of the guys I worked with got to drive it on the road course, and he was just delighted by the way it handled, and he wrote about that in the magazine.
It's always been overshadowed by the GNX and the Grand National for collectability, though. But
Yeah.
hopefully you make a video and people get to know about it. And
Well, and to be fair to the GNs are a lot faster in the legend than they ever were in real life.
it's true.
Same for the GNX. You ask them, oh, they were 12-second cars. Well, they weren't 12-second
No,
cars.
not stock.
The mythology is what drives the collectability.
Mhm.
It drives the fantasy. You know, we love them for what they are. We love them for what they were, what they could be. And in some ways, we love them for what they never were.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
One thing we haven't brought up is that all these cars are automatics. Couldn't get a stick. They didn't really trust a stick for durability for the torque at that.
Well, you can never get a 350 TPI with a stick.
Mm-hmm.
You know, unless you were in a Corvette and you had the ZF 6-speed or the Doug Nash 4+3.
Right now, the best bang for the buck is the 98 2002 Trans Ams. They have LS1s in them, and you can get in. The guys want the sticks. You could, so those cars are very desirable, going up in value.
And do you have one of those?
I have a Firehawk 2002, and it's a convertible, and it's an automatic. So the one thing I get from the muscle car guys is, oh, too bad it's an automatic, or too bad it's a convertible. But not everybody wants, a T-top,
Right.
Stick car.
And convertibles, as the owner of a 5-liter convertible, I like it. It's a very sensory overload when the top is down and you.
Yeah, this is Florida. I mean, palm trees everywhere.
Yeah. So. And besides, what's the most valuable muscle car?
Exactly.
Hemi-Cuda convertible.
Exactly.
It's not the Hemi-Cuda hardtop.
Right.
So.
And again, I like driving cars because they're fun.